Hey everyone. So for today's lecture, we're going to be looking at the Civil Rights Movement. This was the movement that began in the 1950s, culminated with the passage of significant legislation in the 1960s. And this is really a movement towards the ideals set forth in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution that all men are created equal, that all people of the United States are destined to have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So America as a society has been plagued by racism throughout its history, and particularly racism towards African Americans. Of course, it begins with slavery, goes to the Civil War, and racism lasts throughout the country and still lasts today. But there was really rampant racism up through the 1950s. You can see that displayed in these advertisements from the 50s. Here's some more advertisements that show you just how prevalent racism was in consumerism and advertising. You can see African Americans here using broken English. You can see depictions that would go back to slavery, the idea of servants waiting on you, waiting to give white people delicious recipes, delicious food. So the idea here is that racism is really rampant during this era. So let's take a minute to look at situations that occurred in the 1950s occurred when this racism was so rampant, and then compare it to what happens today. So first we'll look at Elizabeth Eckford and Hazel Masry. In 1957, schools were forced to desegregate, and so this is one of the first schools that desegregated in Little Rock, Arkansas. And you can see Masry here following Eckford to school in 1957. She was calling out for the 15-year-old girl to be lynched for breaking segregation. So you can see the hatred in that woman's face there as she's following this person who's just trying to go to school. However, years later, Masry apologized and asked for forgiveness on the Oprah Winfrey Show in 1999. So the idea here is that some of these scars that had existed had healed as a result of the Civil Rights Movement. James Meredith was the first African American to attend Mississippi State University. However, he was not welcome there. During a protest, Meredith was gunned down. He was shot as he was protesting racial discrimination. However, years later, Meredith would embrace Ole Miss. Meredith spoke at his son's graduation from the University of Mississippi, or Ole Miss, where he earned a doctorate in business. So again, the idea that these scars can be healed in certain ways, that these injustices began to be healed, and we'll see why that is. Here we have the story of the Loving couple. Mildred Jeter and Richard Loving of Stanton, Virginia, got married in 1958. Jeter was an African American woman, Loving was a white man. This was considered illegal in Virginia. They were arrested for getting married. They had to flee the state and sued for the right to be husband and wife. This decision to arrest them was overturned in the Supreme Court case of Loving versus Virginia that ruled that interracial marriages were legal in the United States. And because of all of this, it is not uncommon today to see interracial couples. 18% of couples are between an African American and a white person, and 10% of marriages are now interracial. Sports used to be divided upon race. The idea is that African Americans could not play with white people. Baseball had the Negro League, which is an African American baseball league. However, the color barrier was broken in 1947 when the Brooklyn Dodgers brought Jackie Robinson to the major leagues. However, the Brooklyn Dodgers were mocked by angry country for allowing an African American, Jackie Robinson, to play in an all-white professional baseball league. But today, many of the biggest sports leagues in the world are dominated by African American athletes. Black players make up 80% of the NBA and 65% of the NFL. For most of American history, African Americans were not allowed to serve in the military. U.S. military forces were not desegregated until 1948, 3 years after World War II. African Americans who did serve were forced to fight in a few African American units that were segregated from white soldiers. This has changed as well. In 1989, Colin Powell became chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the first African American to hold this position. The Joint Chiefs of Staff is the head of all the military branches in the United States. African Americans now make up 17% of the U.S. military forces. That is more than their share of population. Schools remain segregated even after the Supreme Court ruled that they needed to be desegregated. So Jim Crow laws actually went into the 1960s. Roanoke County schools, the school district we're all a part of, were not desegregated until 1966 when Arnold Burton students, they went to Burton School, these were African American students, were placed in white schools. So they were forced to desegregate. So again, not until 1966 did we see desegregation in Roanoke County schools. Today, Roanoke County Schools is made up of a diverse student body. That is, we see people from many different ethnic backgrounds, many different racial backgrounds who contribute greatly to our demographics in the county. Before the Civil Rights Movement, the government of the United States was white. Only 6 African Americans had been elected to Congress and only 1 senator prior to the 1960s. So in all the history of the Congress, only 1 senator and 5 representatives have been elected to Congress. The idea of even associating with African Americans in government was frowned upon. President Theodore Roosevelt invited Booker T. Washington for dinner at the White House in 1901, and he had to apologize to the country for allowing a black guest into the White House. So you can see how racist the society is, even having someone to dinner. They're not even involved in politics, just discussing that with the President of the United States. The President had to publicly apologize for this. Look at how much has changed by 2008 when the United States elected the first African American president. So Barack Obama would not have been elected without the votes of white Americans. 68 million Americans voted for Obama in 2008. 42 million of them were white. So that is that from going from people protesting an African American being allowed to have dinner in the White House to voting for an African American president, there has been great change in the United States. So the question is, why did these things change? Why do we see a society that has rampant racism, has legal segregation, has an idea of separate races being fair, to a society today where we see greater equality, we see greater opportunity for all races, and what really the key to all this is the civil rights movement. So the 1950s were still a time of Jim Crow, particularly in the South, of a segregated society, of a white society and a black society. However, there began to be aspects that were pushed back against by many figures in society. We get to see that this might be inherently wrong, that there is something wrong with the idea of an America being separated between race. The precedent for segregation was the idea of separate but equal. The idea is that you could have 2 different facilities, one for African Americans, one for whites, as long as they were equal. But the problem is this didn't exist. It only existed in theory, not in practice. And you can see this here in the different pictures from an African American school on the left to a white school on the right. African Americans were not given the same opportunities, the same facilities that white people were given. And they were separate, but they were not equal. The precedent for separate but equal was created in the Plessy versus Ferguson case in 1896. This decision was overturned by the Brown versus Board of Education decision by the Supreme Court in 1955. This decision ruled that separate schools were unequal. That is, when you separate people, no matter what facilities you give them, just by separating them means that they are unequal in some status. This case was brought forward in Brown was a young African American woman who challenged the segregated schools in Topeka, Kansas, and it also included a Virginia case, Davis versus County School Board of Prince Edward County. And so basically what this meant is that there were several cases that were brought forward in the Brown decision, and it overturned segregation. The NAACP led the way in this case and led the way in bringing the case before the Supreme Court and arguing it in front of the Supreme Court. Thurgood Marshall, pictured here, led the defense team in the national case. Oliver Hill led the defense in Virginia. Barbara Jones, student leader in Prince Edward County, defended Prince Edward County. And Earl Warren was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court that overheard this case. The verdict in this landmark Supreme Court case of Brown versus Board of Education was that it was time to desegregate schools. The Warren Court ruled that the idea of separate but equal was unconstitutional. But this was a period of rampant racism, and this was not a popular verdict throughout the United States. There were protests throughout the United States. You can see protests here say race mixing is communism. Remember the story of Eckford and Mazur we talked about just a minute ago? That was a result of desegregating schools. People protest, people called for continued segregation. They said that this was un-American. In particular, Southerners rejected the verdict. You can see pictures here of boys protesting. The idea is that white people did not want to go to school with African Americans, and that this was like tyranny of the government by forcing them to desegregate their schools. So what began in the immediate aftermath of this, particularly in the South, was massive resistance to desegregation. And the result of this was that many schools shut down. So the way that many school districts did enact that massive resistance was simply to shut down the school district. This happened throughout the South. In particular, it happened in Prince Edward County in Virginia, where schools were shut down for 5 years. So rather than desegregate the schools, they just said, we're not having school anymore. And you could see these young African American girls protesting that, saying, why can't I go back to school? The idea is that they were just like, if you're going to force us to desegregate, we just won't have school at all. So with school shutting down, whites simply left the school. People created private academies to avoid desegregation. They created schools outside of the public school system, and whites left urban city school systems to move out to school systems away from African Americans. As a result of all this resistance, particularly in the South, many schools suffered. So while segregation had been declared unconstitutional in 1945 with the Brown decision, many schools were simply closed down or not given funding. So you can see here, this is a Mississippi public school in 1968, 14 years after that decision. You can see the poor quality. You have children in a rundown schoolhouse with a wood-burning stove, sharing books, sitting on broken down benches. The idea here is that it took a long time after this decision for change to be seen in public schools. So one of the large aspects that began to change with the civil rights movement was the printing of photography and stories about problems in the South. It's really hard to look away from a picture. It's really hard to take your eye off something that you see is really shocking. And one of the first things to really kind of turn public opinion was the case of Emmett Till. Till was a 14-year-old boy from Chicago who was visiting family in Mississippi in 1955. Till supposedly said, "Bye, baby," to a white woman as she walked out of a store. No one heard Till. It was just the white woman's word. He said this to me. Family members of this woman kidnapped Till, beat him to death, and threw him in a river. His body was recovered 3 days later and was badly destroyed by the situation. So he was murdered, thrown into a river. And what happened is his parents demanded his body be brought back to Chicago and given an open casket funeral. And pictures were taken from the autopsy, from the funeral, and they were given out to the national media. They were published in national publications, and photos of the body in his funeral began to spark outrage. At the institution of lynching, at the institution of extrajudicial killings in the South. And you can see here a picture of that. You can see Till's destroyed body and his parents looking devastated over it. So these kind of pictures, these things would really help aid kind of the moral imperative of the civil rights movement. One way that African Americans began to protest segregation, began to protest the separate society, was with the Montgomery bus boycotts in the 1950s. These boycotts began with Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks was an African American woman who, when told to give up her seat at the front of the bus to a white person who moved to the back of the bus, as was custom, simply said, "No, I'm not leaving." And this triggered a protest movement in which African Americans began to boycott the bus system in Montgomery. And this really begins the nature of the protests of the civil rights movement. So protests became a huge part of the civil rights movement. In particular, civil rights marches were used by protesters to call out the injustices of a segregated society. So these were peaceful, non-violent marches through southern cities to protest segregation. And they used a form of protest known as civil disobedience. This is that they will disobey laws that they consider unjust. They will not use violence, but they will simply march. They will not give in to segregation, as with Rosa Parks. And this is what really gets it moving within the civil rights movement. Many of the protesters were children. They were family members. They were churchgoers. You can see here African Americans protesting segregation in the South. You can see all different ages, sex protesting. There were children's marches throughout the South. So that is, children would go to the streets and march and protest segregation. Remember, schools have been desegregated, but in the South, a lot of schools have just simply been shut down. So these pictures, this movement really kind of gets the moral imperative and the idea that there's something wrong. One of the ways that people would protest segregation are in what is known as sit-ins. A sit-in is basically where African Americans would go and sit in a segregated area. That is, they would sit in a white-only area and just sit there. They weren't doing anything violent. They weren't causing any riots, but what they would do is basically just show the inequality of the situation just simply by sitting in a chair they were not supposed to. But while the protesters at sit-ins didn't do anything but simply sit at the counter, people reacted harshly, reacted almost violently to this. They were really upset that they would dare to break these norms. And you can see here this picture of white people dumping stuff on sit-in protesters as they just simply sit at a counter. Again, these pictures get out. This is what really starts to change people's ideas. When you see people simply sitting at a countertop while a bunch of people glare at them and dump stuff on top of their heads, things are wrong. Local governments begin to attack the protesters. They begin to attack people on the streets. Again, non-violent protesters. So you have pictures like this of the Birmingham Fire Department spraying African American protesters with fire hoses. Protests in Birmingham boiled over in 1963, and we get some of the most impactful and lasting images of the civil rights movement. In particular, this image here of a young African American being attacked by dogs in the streets of Birmingham. He's standing there calmly while dogs are attacking him. This is a quote that was from a newspaper that went out nationally. It said, "It's the police, the state troopers, and the sheriff who are doing most of the beating. When 82-year-old Cager Lee marches, a state trooper whips him until he's bloody. Jimmy Lee Jackson, Cager's grandson, carries his grandfather into a cafe, but the troopers swarm right into the cafe. One trooper hits Jimmy's mother, another shoots Jimmy in the stomach. He dies 7 days later." So again, this picture, that quote is being sent out nationally. People are seeing what's happening in the South, and this is begins to really change ideas that something there's wrong with this. It is during this time in the early 60s that Martin Luther King Jr. steps forward as the great leader of the civil rights movement in the United States. King, in particular, promotes the idea of civil disobedience and protesting segregation through nonviolent means, and he led a massive march on Washington, D.C. to bring attention to the needs for civil rights. One of the great quotes from King is, "One has not only a legal but moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws." That is the basis of civil disobedience, the idea that if there are laws that they consider unjust, they have the right to stand up and protest those laws. So he brings this movement into the forefront and becomes the great leader of the movement. So King's leadership really peaks with the March on Washington in 1963. This is when hundreds of thousands of protesters descend on Washington, D.C., and it kind of showed the power of the nonviolent protests. It is during this March on Washington that King gives his most famous speech, his "I Have a Dream" speech, in which he lays out his hopes and his dreams for a non-racial future, for a future of equality. And this kind of really sums up the nature of the civil rights movement and the hope of the movement. And this led to public support for civil rights legislation. So LBJ begins to support civil rights. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act is passed by Congress with the support of the president, which desegregated public facilities. So while the Brown decision had said that it is illegal to have segregated facilities, it is now becomes a law and has outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origins. This is a landmark act. Following the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act is passed in 1965. What the Voting Rights Act does is it outlaws literacy tests. These were popular, particularly in the South, to keep African Americans from voting. So federal registers were sent to the South to register new voters, and you can see in 1965, registered black voters in Mississippi went from 12% to 80% of the African American population. So this is franchising African Americans. This is giving them the right to have their voice heard in a democracy. So all this movement, the sacrifice of the protesters, the passage of the legislation lead to great change in the United States. We live in a much more equal society today. African Americans have a much more prominent role than they ever could have had in the 1940s and 50s. So you have people like Tiger Woods and Serena Williams who are heroes to millions. You have LeBron James, arguably one of the most famous people in the world, Oprah Winfrey, one of the richest people in the United States. You have people like Beyonce and Michelle Obama, African American women who are world famous and considered some of the most influential people in the world. And in 2008, Barack Obama was elected the first African American president of the United States. This was something that a lot of people thought might never happen. So the idea is that there has been great progress as a result of the civil rights movement. But America still has deep scars, scars of racism, scars of hatred, scars of segregation, of slavery, and we still see racism throughout our society today. These pictures are taken from the protests in Charlottesville several years ago. It's pretty shocking to see a white person carrying a Nazi flag on an American street. But the idea here is that the future is not guaranteed. There has been great progress since the civil rights movement. But again, we have to continue to move towards a country where the ideals of the United States, the ideals laid out in the Declaration of Independence, that all men, all people are created equal.